challenge and adversity in their lives so that we can see what is really possible and what it really takes. I'm your host, Jordan Kilpatrick Smith, and joining me this week is Eric Nease. Eric is a writer and jiu-jitsu instructor faced with the survival of his business during the COVID-19 pandemic. Just a quick reminder that each episode is done live, so if you'd like to ask your own questions, be a part of our discussions, you can join us on YouTube and or Facebook. Eric, thanks for being here with me.
Thanks for having me, man. This is pretty cool.
Yeah. So where does your story start?
I think in the context of, we had a brief chat for this kind of arc of my life and the challenges that I've been facing. It seems to start when I started Infinite BJJ, but I think the impetus to start that to begin with really begins kind of in my mid-20s when I was working at the JiuJitsu Cancer Center. And I had a pretty difficult run-in with depression, and I kind of had to, I guess face a couple things regarding myself, and make some decisions that really put me on a path that I could be proud of and that I could pursue. So it would probably start with that major obstacle, probably somewhere in my mid-20s.
Yeah. So working at the JiuJitsu in Hamilton, Ontario, and you hit this depression. Was there like a specific cause for it, or was it the slow, gradual buildup?
So once the signs for it happened far before. Me personally, I remember I ended up going to therapy for it for a while. I thought it arose from one aspect of my life and my mentality, whereas my therapist was pretty adamant that it came from somewhere else. So regardless, I remember seeing two things were happening. One, I was incredibly dissatisfied with my life, and I found that I was trying to fill that dissatisfaction with things. I was really at the end of what I could afford, and I would use like that little extra money to buy a car that I probably shouldn't have had at the time. And then that was kind of like indicative of maybe some symptoms that I was trying to throw band-aids on a wound that needed more attention. I remember specifically one instance, and this isn't what kind of culminated in the depression. The depression for me was something that, like, over time, especially over this 1 year, I think it was 2014, it really just started taking away from my day-to-day activity. Like, I wasn't able to operate or function in the same way. And that's kind of the thing, right? Like, once mental illness becomes disruptive to your life, that's when you have to do something about it. But in terms of me actually taking action, I remember one day, one of my responsibilities as a research assistant was I had to cold call other doctors' offices. And I had to ask them to participate in a survey. No, nobody really wants to do this, right? Like, nobody wants to get that call. And I get that, but most of the secretaries were understanding because this was in a professional capacity. And this one secretary that I got a hold of was so rotten and so rude. And I was already having a bad day. And I just, my mind kind of just shot like 20 years in the future and was like, maybe I'm comfortable where I am, filling my life with things, and then I'm going to turn into that person who's kind of let their misery stew for the past 20 years in a career. That's a great career, but might not be the career for them. So that was kind of one of the things that, like, really made me know that I needed to do something about it in terms of the direction of my life. And then once it started impacting me to the point where I couldn't function, where I didn't feel like myself, that's when I knew that I had to kind of seek some help and work on myself before I could work on my goals and my plans.
Yeah. And when you say that you weren't feeling like yourself anymore, specifically, what were you feeling like?
So I think this comes from like a lot of different places. I was very young, and this is like interesting because I'm sure we'll get to the mentality that I kind of developed coming out of my depression. But mortality has always been something, it sounds really melodramatic, but has always been something that has concerned me from a very young age. Like, I remembered being super, super young and being overwhelmed with this thought of, like, you know, I grew up in a Catholic school, and then I just kind of contemplated what death would be like without an afterlife, without a deity, without anything, like just oblivion, just nothing. And the weight of that kind of was really overwhelming. And I was terrified. I remember being young and being naive and silly enough to think that whatever I did in life, I wanted that to last beyond my life. I wanted to do something bigger than myself so that it could be remembered. And when you're young and stupid, that's for like ego purposes, right? Like I want to be remembered. And then it turned out to be the work that I did, I wanted to be remembered. And then you realize that it's just like, as long as it's good work, that's the most important thing. But a lot of that came from, when I had that call with that rude secretary, it was like, I have a limited amount of time left in my life. And I have proven to myself in some capacity that I was able to do what I love to do. Like I had been coaching Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu a little bit at a student run club, and some other things. So having the ability and knowing that I could do it, combined with like that phone call, just reminded me like the time is limited and I'm wasting it. And like I kind of everything kind of like telescoped in and was like, holy crap, like if I don't do something about this now, I could not do something about it until tomorrow. And tomorrow is always tomorrow. So it really kind of made me want to prioritize things in a way that put the most important things first. And that's where I kind of developed some mindsets coming out of the depression that I've tried to employ for the rest of my life.
Yeah. So, and for anyone who's listening and they themselves are struggling with a similar depression, what would you say the first step for you was, or the first realization, or the first thing that really helped pull you out and change the trajectory of the mental health?
I have that typical guy thing, like don't go to the doctor, don't complain about your problems kind of thing. So for me, I think the interesting thing was that everything in my life on paper was as good as it could possibly be. I had a great career. I loved my wife, still love my wife. All that stuff was really important for me. And it was great. I had a house in my mid-20s, which not a lot of people have the privilege of having. Everything was going well, but I was still incredibly dissatisfied. Something was gnawing at me and I could really, really feel it. And it got to the point where like I was having breakdowns and I was having very angry episodes, and I wouldn't lash out violently at anybody, but I remember like I would almost have like an episode and then I would be ashamed with my own self because I'm like, this isn't who you are.
Yeah.
And it's coming to terms with that enough to pass that on to somebody who can at least offer some help. So again, the step to therapy was a very difficult one. It was an ego crushing one because I'd been through harder times than that by far in my life. But there was something about that time in my life where I just needed that. And once I was taken sufficiently away from who I wasn't the kind of person to freak out and be angry all the time. I wasn't the kind of person to like get mad at other people for shit happening in my life. So once I recognized that, that's when I kind of had to be like, okay, it's not you. You're sick, and you need to basically work on whatever engrams, whatever thought patterns are kind of corrupting your psyche.
Yeah. Yeah. So you had all of the check marks on paper, but you were still in this place of dissatisfaction and the spiral that begins to happen, right? So, okay, fantastic. How long did it take you to get out of that?
I can't remember how many months it was before I sought help. After I sought help, it was probably only I would say 2 months from the beginning of therapy, and I went weekly, to kind of coming out of it with some semblance of capacity of kind of returning to myself enough that like, okay, we have to move past this. And it's funny because, I mean, we talked a little bit about this, and I think this is going too far back. My whole thing was coming to terms with your own mortality is something that I feel like is very uncomfortable for a lot of people. Like if I talk to somebody, I'm like, look, you're going to die one day. And they're like, yeah, but everybody dies. I'm like, well, if you think about that, that's super, super heavy. So for me, a lot of that derived from that kind of facing that consequence. Whereas my therapist thought that a lot of it derived from childhood trauma because there were some familial conflicts that did happen when I was growing up. The mentality coming out the back end had a little bit to do with forgiveness of those familial conflicts, moving on. But in moving on, I still had to, even though my therapist didn't focus on it too much, I had to deal with what was gnawing at me regarding not accomplishing my goals within my lifetime, having this limited lifetime and using it as quickly as possible. Because if not, I had seen too many talented people fall into comfort. And I didn't want my work to die off that way.
Yeah. And who did you become post-depression? Well, like, what did the depression do for you? Because there's always something good that comes on the other side of these things, right?
Right. So yeah, we also spoke about how there's kind of 3 points in my life where I feel like I'm drastically different after than before. And the depression was one of them. So the mentality that I and I haven't talked too much about this yet because I want to try to put it into writing in a way that can resonate with people. But I ended up taking the thing that was kind of haunting me and I tried to transform it into a motivating factor that I could base my life around. Because if I couldn't shake this mentality out of my head, then at least I could use it in a way that was beneficial instead of destructive, because it was very destructive at the time. So knowing that I only have a certain amount of time on this earth, I kind of developed a semi-stoic philosophy that I called my 5-in-1 principle. And the 5-in-1 principle basically says that you should live as if you're going to die in 5 minutes, and then everybody dies now or in one moment. And those are kind of heavy concepts to juggle. But for me, if you ask yourself, right, there's like a common hypothetical. If you had 24 hours to live, what would you do? Well, you can do a lot of things in 24 hours. If you ask somebody what they would do if they had 5 minutes to live, 5 minutes isn't really enough time to do anything. So if you ask yourself, if you were to die in 5 minutes, or if you were to propose that, it forces you to think, have I already done today the things that are most important to me? If the answer is yes, then I'm okay with whatever I'm doing in that moment. If the answer is no, then I have to change my priorities. So for instance, if I'm playing video games and I'm about to die in 5 minutes, did I play with my daughter today? Did I work on my novel today? Did I teach some jiu-jitsu today? Did I do something of value? If yes, then it's not a tragedy if I was playing video games. But if I woke up first thing in the morning playing video games while my daughter is in the other room and I didn't play with her and I died in 5 minutes, that would be horrible. I would never. It would be a horrible thing to think about. So that kind of forced me to be like, okay, put down the things that don't matter, right? I ended up selling off all the things that I didn't need. I sold a nice car. I sold an expensive guitar that I spent 2 years paying for, all this stuff. And I tried to do that because it's a principle that's forgiving. It allows you to have leisure time so long as your priorities are taken care of. The other thing, and it's something that's hard to carry around all the time because again, it's a heavy concept, is I don't have it up here now. Maybe I can send over the quote later. In Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, he has a line about how every man only lives in the moment and nobody can take that moment from you, etc., etc. So everybody's like, I'm in my early 30s, right? If I'm lucky, I can live into my 80s, but I don't experience 80s now. I'm experiencing, 32-year-old Eric on this day, Saturday morning, 10:15. So I don't die in the future. I die now. I experience death now. And that only happens in one moment, right? In one moment, like you're extinguished. One of the terms that actually used to trigger my depression a lot, because I would do chart reviews for my job where I would look at people's cancer cases. Mm-hmm. When they die, the term that doctors use is expired. Like fruit, like food. Yeah. And that was so like clinical and detached that used to trigger me every time I read it. It was crazy. But if that only happens in one moment and you're only living now, then every moment you live is indistinguishable from the moment that your life is done for eternity. So it should be handled as such. And that doesn't mean that it's like, this moment is as heavy as it needs to be, but it needs to come with its own sort of appreciation. So when things start getting overwhelming to me now, I try to pull back from the past, pull back from the future, kind of like solidify myself right now, I just kind of do a little bit of appreciation because there's a lot for me to be thankful about. And those two concepts, the 5 and 1, is really what I had to adopt going forward. And that's kind of what propelled me through taking more publishing seriously, starting the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Academy, and really doing what was necessary for the things that were important to me because I knew I had that limited time.
Yeah. Okay. So I just want to go over that one more time, make sure that I understand what you're saying there. So after the depression, you developed this 5 and 1 principle, which is this principle that you use to live in the moment and have continual self-awareness, right?
Right.
And so it's, if I was going to die in 5 minutes, would I be okay with that? Would I be okay with what has happened in the day so far?
Right.
And understanding that the only thing that ever truly exists is the moment, and that this moment is indistinguishable from the next moment, but it's still the moment, right? And we need to appreciate that when you die in one moment,
Right.
and that every moment is precious and should not be brushed off as if it's inconsequential. Am I understanding that right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Amazing. And what did that start to do for you? Because you came out of this depression, you said, after there's 3 milestones in my life where I was different afterwards, and the depression was one of them. So you developed this principle, and what did that principle do for you?
I think that principle allowed me to own the thing that was controlling me. Because before that, I was almost like a passive victim to my own thoughts. Whereas once I identified those, and I knew that they weren't leaving, like that, I couldn't get rid of these ideas. And if you read my fiction, it's not my fiction isn't a bummer, but a lot of it deals with these concepts because I can't get rid of them in my head. So if it's an underlying theme in my art and everything that I do, I better find a way to get on top of it, to use it to my advantage. And basically it was doing that. And then I think every time something heavy like that happens to somebody and they have to overcome it. This year I read a book from a brilliant author. You don't win the MacArthur Genius grant by being mediocre. She's named Octavia Butler, and she wrote The Parable of the Sower. And in it, she comes up with her own religion and called the Book of the Living. And one of the beginning of the chapters, it says, in order to rise from its own ashes, a phoenix must first burn. And it's kind of like that's what happened. It was like I kind of burned off that previous version of myself. You're done. Okay, I'm no longer going to sit underneath the weight of my own mortality. It's an inevitability that all people must face. So if that's and all people manage one way or the other. So I better find a way to get on top of it. And that was the biggest thing, was basically controlling and recontextualizing my issue in a way that could be a boon rather than a burden.
Yeah. Nice. Cool. So you learned to take something that was holding you back and make it work for you, not against you. Incredibly powerful, and clearly not as easy as like easier said than done, right?
There's an incredible amount of pain involved. So I think one of the things that comes up a lot, and it always strikes me as disingenuous, is like the very bubbly, constantly positive kind of thing. Like it's, everything can have, a silver lining and an upside, and you can find those, but I have found, for me personally, finding those is not a matter of a meme or some nice sentiment or necessarily even a hug. It's a lot of very difficult, very destructive, almost internalization. There has to be some kind of tearing down of who you are and some rebuilding that happens, and that never comes easy. Like that's usually a really rough process, and it either happens when something has crushed us sufficiently that we don't have a choice but to change, right? It could be in our environment, or it can come when we're sick enough with our own BS that we have to move on in a different way. And I find that I say that a lot to people, is that you can have all the lessons to change you want. If you're not sick of your own BS, you'll be happy with your own BS. So you got to kind of twist that, which is the hardest part.
Yeah. Can you say that again?
um, yeah, I was like semi-lucid there for a second. Yeah, so
If you're not sick enough of your own BS.
If you're not sick enough of your own BS, then you're going to be stuck with your own BS. Like that's basically it. You're going to be relegated to the same thought patterns that are controlling you, unless you're so sick of them that you're like, this is nonsense. I have to stop this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's an underappreciated or under thought of lesson and message that people really would benefit from considering more, is that we create our lives, right? And are we okay with the smoke and mirrors that we provide for ourselves? And
Yes.
until we decide, I hate this, well, nothing's going to change. 100%. And it's an uncomfortable process, right? Is what you were just saying there.
It's so uncomfortable. And one of the things that I wish is that, like, because if I'm thinking back to Eric, who was in the throes of depression, hearing Eric now, there's some things that I'm saying that back then I would have been like, all right, buddy, I get it, right? Like, I already know that. And it's not about knowing it, it's about doing it.
Yeah.
which is the frustrating thing. But I think the other thing that would happen is that, and this often really gets to me, and I always tell myself these things because I didn't fall into a lot of my hobbies and a lot of the things that people know me for until after, like when I was a teenager, all the way up until 18, 19 years old, I didn't play guitar. I didn't write novels. I didn't do jujitsu. It's like, what did I do when I was a teenager? I was like, not a lot of good things, to be honest with you. I was a good student. Like I had aspirations of being an academic, but like in terms of like my social life and my personal stuff, not good. So one of the things I always tell myself is like, now that I've come out on the tail end of that, and I've been able to do so much, I desperately wish that I could go back to Eric, who was in the throes of depression, and be like, look at what you did. Look at what you came out of here with. And then go back to 16-year-old Eric and then be like, Eric, like, look at what ends up happening. Like, you're lost, you're an idiot, you're doing these things because you feel socially awkward, and this helps you feel better. What I've been able to do since coming out of the tail end of those things, I just desperately wish that the person who was struggling when they were younger could see what happened, because it's impossible to know on the other side, but it's so powerful.
And that's exactly why this podcast exists.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a great platform.
So where do we go next? You develop this principle, you begin to change, you deconstruct and reconstruct yourself. And what follows that?
What follows that is the fallibility of every individual, which is comfort, which is complacency. It's the same thing, the same thing that kind of started creeping in when I was working at the hospital. When I was a clinical research assistant, life was going good because I could cover the bills and I had the house. That started happening again, and it happened earlier this year with COVID, because I was working, and look, actually, sorry, way before that. I guess where it goes from there is that I take the lessons I learn and then I apply them to something that I think matters. And sometimes I do get a lot of cheesy lines from various memes and things like that. So I know there's countless motivational montages and stuff put up on YouTube. And one of them has Arnold Schwarzenegger saying, like, who do you want to be when you grow up? Like, not what do you want to be, but who do you want to be? So once I kind of internalized that, because that really resonated with me, I take those lessons and I apply them in a way that's the most fulfilling to me, which was, I want to use what I'm best at and what I can help the others most with, in order to forge a career. And what I used was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I would love to do that with my writing, but as a technical career, writing is very difficult. So I went with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu first, because that had helped me so much. And Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, actually, a lot of the lessons in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu are also what helped me kind of emerge from depression a little bit stronger. And it gave me a little bit of that anti-fragility necessary to be stronger on the other side so that I can kind of put the wheels in motion to start that club. That came with its own challenges, obviously. Running businesses is not easy. But I had a goal in mind. And once I was able to kind of work on myself to a point where I had a good foundation that I could build off of, then I was able to have some direction with my vision and be able to implement that in a way that I thought could mean something.
Yeah. So you mentioned there are lessons that you learned in BJJ, and BJJ helped develop this anti-fragility. First of all, what is BJJ?
Okay, so for those who are not familiar, BJJ stands for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. In a nutshell, on the surface, this is a grappling martial art that is concerned with clinching your opponent and typically taking them to the ground, where it's much easier for a smaller person to control a bigger person. That can lead to diffusing a situation. It could lead to some sort of submission. Some aspects of it are for self-defense, some of it are for sport, but it's the art and practice of control that leads to submission, a martial art that's typically devoid of striking and mostly concerned with grappling.
Nice. And what are some of the lessons that were really impactful for you? Yeah, the impactful lessons of BJJ.
So BJJ, I'm not sure if I completely agree with the sentiment, but I've seen it made before, and it's not a bad way to look at it. It's designed to make you fail. And I think that's critical because most people don't want to undertake things because failure really sucks. But nobody steps into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I've been doing this thing for, it's going on like 14 years now. Nobody steps on the mat good. People can step on the mat athletic, but everybody sucks when they get on the mat. And you can tell because people who, like me, like I'm tall, but I'm a thin guy, 165 pounds, routinely go roll with people who are 200 to 300 pounds with no problem if they just started. Now, if they have a couple years of experience, those guys kill me. But like your average person doesn't know what they're doing. So when you start Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and if anybody here who's watching is a white belt, we've all felt it, and we've felt it for a very long time. You come in, you get your butt kicked, you have to tap out, you get your ego crushed a little bit, and then you come back the next day.
Yeah.
You tap out, and then you finish the roll. And then the next round you find a new partner, and then you tap out maybe 4 times in 5 minutes, and then you finish the roll, and you go to the next one, and then you come back the next day. So this process of incremental failures that allow for significantly higher gains in attitude, in technique, in personal well-being, I think has to be internalized outside of the practice itself, so that you can recognize the real mechanism that jiu-jitsu is training in the body, which is essentially anti-fragility, or the ability to be stronger from obstacles rather than be broken down by them.
Yeah. And I normally don't like throwing in my own 2 cents too often, but I love jiu-jitsu so much because of that constant failure that it provides me. It's like, I think you might have been there the first day I ever did jiu-jitsu. And I walked in and I was like, okay, I have a black belt. I have a black belt in Taekwondo. I've done martial arts my entire life. I'm probably going to get tossed around, but you know what? I should be okay. Oh my God. I did not stand a chance. I remember there's a purple belt who wasn't even looking at me. He was having a conversation with someone behind him, not even facing me. And I was just like, I cannot do anything here.
Yeah.
And that failure that it provides is so important to me. So you mentioned anti-fragility, the allowing the things that would like normally hinder us to then propel us forward, right? Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. So this is a term that Nassim Taleb popularized in his book, either called Antifragility or Antifragile. And basically it's broken down into 3 categories. There are things that are fragile, things that are resilient, and things that are anti-fragile. So things that are fragile break down with disorder, resilient or robust resist disorder, and can kind of defend themselves, Antifragility is actually, they benefit from disorder. And one of the examples that is great is the peanut allergy epidemic. Jonathan Haidt highlights this in his book, The Coddling of the American Mind. And he actually references Nassim Taleb, where he says, exposure to peanuts develops resistance to peanut allergies. But because a few people got peanut allergies, there was a big scare and they told parents to stop eating peanuts. And what that ended up happening was the consequence of that story was that more kids ended up developing peanut allergies because they didn't have the stimulus necessary to create that overcompensated defense. The same thing happens with muscular growth, right? We shock the muscles that grow bigger to handle a higher load. Same thing happens with vaccination, right? So basically the process of antifragility for me is adding in incremental, controlled, and understandable failures in a process in a way that allows you to overcome other obstacles that you face outside of that specific practice. So the adversity, for instance, that we face in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is very specific to that practice. But after I roll with, a lawyer, a plumber, a welder, a teacher, a black belt, a white belt, a 150-pound person, a 300-pound person, a 20-year-old, a 60-year-old, I got tapped out. I tapped them out. Once I leave that academy, any obstacle that I meet in day-to-day life seems far less significant because we have overcome such a big barrier of fear and we've already seen what it feels like to fail. We know a lot of those consequences more than anybody could ever fathom. So taking that out of the mat and into your day-to-day life is an aspect of anti-fragility that I think is the true benefit of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Like that is what that's what helped me get out of depression, because I was like, if I can do the physical reps for how to pass somebody's guard, I can do the mental reps for my cognitive behavioral therapy to identify the problem and then stop the problem from happening before it gets there. Much like, Jordan, you do jiu-jitsu. One of the most annoying things you do is you ask a higher belt, you say, how do I get out of this move? And they say, don't get in it to begin with, which is like the worst thing to hear, but it's also the truest thing, right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And if I can use that for trying to not get choked by a 250-pound linebacker, then I can use that for my own thought patterns in my head. I can use it for, if I didn't get this job, that's just like a tap out in a round. I continue the round. It's no big deal. And that way the failures are not something to be avoided. They're just an accepted part of the process.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. This is the anti-fragility concept, I think, is something when I read the book, I was like, holy crap, it's so true. And right. I never even considered it. Again, I normally don't like throwing my thoughts into these stories because this is your story, but there's something that I want to talk about with you. And because I think this will benefit the users as well. And I'd love to hear how these thoughts were or were not in part of your story. So we as human beings are anti-fragile. Disorder, chaos, suppression, it makes us stronger, right? You mentioned muscle growth. When I was reading the book, the thing that I thought of was emotions rather. So our emotions are anti-fragile. And the more pressure that we put onto them, the stronger that they grow. So a lot of the times what we do in our society is instead of dealing with something, sadness, anger, frustration, etc., we bottle it up, right? We squish it down. We say, get out of here. And what happens is because they are naturally anti-fragile, they become stronger, right? You think about anyone who's been sad or, at anger, you push it down. Next time it comes up, it's even bigger, right? Until all of a sudden you have this nuclear explosion.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? And do you think that played into the depression or some of the struggles that you were going through?
I think that, especially once you mentioned anger, the way that my wife, I don't know if she's out in the back with my daughter or not, but if she's hearing this, she's probably shaking her head. The way that my emotions usually manifest in a negative way is anger. I have a lot of natural anger And it's something that, it's one of those, I get this from watching my dad too. So it's one of those things where like you get angry and then there's no use of getting angry. So instead of like reconciling those two things, there's no use in getting angry. So, let's just dial it back and figure something out. There's no use in getting angry. So of course I don't have to be angry. And then you're angry that you're not supposed to be angry. And then it just kind of like cycles in, and then you get even more angry, and then you just leave. And then that anger is just kind of like excellent, like it's become even better. And he's like, oh, I'm even stronger for next time. And that is me. Like my depression, there were certain parts where I had a really, really hard time with like the kind of like a sadness aspect of it. But a lot of it was like anger episodes, like things that, I recognize that it was a sick version of me, but like things I'm still very not proud of to this day. I was never violent with anybody or anything, but just like gestures that I would do, or like I'd thrown a cup of coffee once and out of my car. I was like very things that I look back on now, and like I feel like people who know me would be like, really, you did that? I was like, yeah, I know, it was not normal. But I think that's an interesting aspect, because I think of anti-fragility always in a positive dimension, and you brought it up in a negative dimension, and that your negative emotions will also become empowered by being shut down, and by being shut down incorrectly, I think, which is why a little bit of guidance and a proper mindset to get through that is so important. Because if you're left to your own devices, the default is to allow your emotions to become anti-fragile, and the more anti-fragile they are, the more difficult they are to overcome, which is an amazing point. And I think that's definitely one of the spirals that kind of exacerbated the conditions of the depression, and something that was really difficult to work out on the other end, which is another point, which is a really good point that you bring up, because people always talk about getting help earlier rather than later. And this is an aside, because this is kind of more of a technical standpoint, but if there is anybody who's going to listen to this and you ever run into mental health issues, just a quick rundown. When I called the hospital regarding my mental illness, it took them 8 months to send me a package. Within that and I had to fill that package and then send it back. Within that 8 months, a lot could have happened. Thankfully, because of HR at work, I was able to get therapy within a couple of weeks, because I told them, and they through work, somehow they were able to do it right away, but through the hospital, 8 months. So the longer you give your symptoms time to become worse, like you said, they are also anti-fragile. So they're going to spiral, they're going to snowball, they're going to get even more powerful. So the longer you wait, the worse it's going to get. So if you feel yourself losing that battle, don't wait to find somebody to help you get those reps in to fix that thought pattern, because it's not even like a weakness thing. It's just it's a recurring thought pattern that is kind of poisoning your mindset, and somebody else can usually help you out of that.
Absolutely. I like to say, you can't see the picture when you're in it, right? So
very true.
Having someone to help you be that mirror that you can then see the picture with is so critical. Okay, so continuing on, you focused this newfound boon towards things that you can use to help other people, specifically BJJ. And where did that take you?
Okay, so I'll run. This took me on the most important kind of trajectory of my life to date, I think, outside of my family. And I say to everybody, outside of my immediate family, Infinite BJJ, which is my academy in Brantford, is the most important thing I've ever done in my life, by far. Our community is amazing. If any of them are watching this, they're literally like they're like an extended family to me. A lot of them, like you spend years with these people. I love training with these people. It's a very special thing. However, it's an incredibly difficult thing. So a quick rundown of the trajectory is I got laid off from my clinical research assistant job. I sold the Subaru. I got a Mazda 5 that was in a car wreck. And I took some money that I had and I opened up a JiuJitsu academy. Now, I actually started Infinite BJJ in Hamilton, Ontario, not in Brantford, Ontario. And I worked out of another martial arts club. That martial arts club took thousands of dollars from me with a disingenuous offer, and then closed up shop a couple of weeks later. And I was without a business. I was pretty despondent, not depressed. It was not the same situation, but I was really bummed out. So I thought to myself, well, what can I do here? I said, I know about probably close to a dozen people who drive from Brantford, Ontario to Hamilton, Ontario, which is about a 35-minute drive, just to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So I said, they must need their own dedicated place. So I decided to go to a city that I knew next to nothing about, had almost no friends in the city, never spent time there, and I opened up. So Infinitum goes under on its first year. I opened up in a new city, not knowing anything. At the end of that year, because I wanted more students, bad business practices, I almost went bankrupt. I ended up, sorry.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I just want to go back and ask a question.
Yeah.
You're like, okay, I'm going to pour my money into this cause that's really important to me. I'm going to open a gym. Right away, life just like slaps you across the face and says, yeah, good. No. How did you stop yourself from quitting? Because I imagine like there must have been, or was there a thought that where you were like, you know what, maybe this isn't for me, or I shouldn't be doing this?
I was in a lucky position. So when I was in my teenage years, I was good at a few things, and I couldn't decide which thing I wanted to do with my life. And it was very, very hard. And I tell younger people all the time not to give up on the things that you love, because those ended up being my career, right? Like before university, I was into writing and jiu-jitsu. During university, I kind of dropped those two things. After university, I ended up starting a freelance writing career and becoming a jiu-jitsu instructor. So once I had taught a little bit of jiu-jitsu, I was lucky enough to know that there was nothing else in this world that I would rather do or rather spend my time doing than teaching other people jiu-jitsu. And it's because of a lot of the things that we've already mentioned, right? Jiu-jitsu is such a positive force in people's lives. And I was never concerned with being a huge competitive gym. I was concerned with giving other people that same benefit that I had. But when my depression was really bad, I kept going to jiu-jitsu and I didn't really tell anybody. Some days I wouldn't talk to anybody, but my training partners just did what they were there to do. They kicked my butt. They were there for me to try and kick their butt. They kind of took me out of my own head and allowed me to be myself again, if only for an hour and a half. And that was incredibly powerful. Both of my parents are factory workers, and my dad even said, he goes, I don't know where you get this business stuff from. Your parents were both clock punchers their whole lives. I said it was from jiu-jitsu, right? It was, I knew what I loved to do, and the lessons from it told me that I had the capacity to do that kind of thing. So I knew that if there was a way that I could make this work, I was going to do everything in my power to make it work, which to date is why Infinitum is still alive. And that's the principle that I continued through these incremental losses. I mean, again, failed in the first year. I started my first year of business again the next year in a city I didn't know. Almost went bankrupt, and I had to apply for a competitive grant, which we were able to win. The year after, I was probably putting in 100 work hours a week between running the academy, running my freelance business, and working on a construction crew, just so I could pay all the bills. And that kind of snowballed into an academy that we have today, which is like a phenomenal community. I love our team so much. We got a great group of people. My favorite compliment that we always get is that when people leave, is they say our guys are tough, but they also say that they're awesome, which is like the best feeling, right? Like you want to go to a place where you feel good to be there, because when you're facing your own demons and when you're in the practice of that antifragility where you have to be vulnerable like that, it really helps to have a good crew of people. But yeah, so that's kind of why I was able to push through, because I knew without a shadow of a doubt, with complete conviction, that I was going to make this work. Even if it failed, I was going to turn around and find a way to manifest my capacity for translating this knowledge for other people.
That's incredible. And that's incredibly hard to do. Right?
Yeah.
That's certainly not an easy thing to hold that conviction when the failures start to stack up, right? And what I'm hearing is this plays into that that so important lesson of failure is what allows us to move forward, right? Failure is what improves us, and we don't need to run from it, which is what jujitsu, one of the big lessons jujitsu taught you. Is that right?
I would say that's exactly right. And I would say it happened on two fronts. I would say from the application perspective of the strict technical, starting a business, running it, blah, 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 all that stuff. That comes from the anti-fragility built in the jiu-jitsu on the mats. In terms of facing those hardships and internalizing those failures and moving forward anyway, that came from coming out of the tail end of depression, because things were bleak to a point where it's like, I told myself, I'm like, you can't take me to a darker place than my mind has already brought me. So nothing is going to break me here. Like I've made it on the other side of this, and don't you dare think you're going to be even close to what I've kind of traversed in order to get to this point. So like, as long as I had that mentality on both my inner self and my ability to apply that, I was going to make it work. Short of like losing all of my money, I was going to make it work.
Yeah. Amazing. And okay, so you got this grant, you were able to stay open.
Right.
Then what?
So yeah, then we went forward. I was working 3 jobs at one point, and then we got to a point where very, very special point in every business owner's life, which is when you can cover all your bills with your business. And for a while there, it was a little bit tongue in cheek, but people would say like, what's the best part about running your own jiu-jitsu academy? And I would say being able to buy groceries, you know, and they're expecting like, oh, you know, you get to do what you love for a living, and 100% that is it. But before you're able to pay your bills, running a business is very, very hard. You have to believe in it. And that's why when people ask me about it, I say, if you don't love it, if you're not totally compelled to do it, there's nothing, absolutely nothing wrong with taking another career path, some kind of job, some kind of whatever, because business is grueling and we don't always live in the most business conducive environment. I won't get political at all, but I do have friends that live in Texas. So I'll just put that out there. I would rather live in Canada than Texas. I want to make that clear.
Right.
So, but yeah, so that was a great point. And then we got to a point where it was time to expand. We had kind of outgrown our previous location. So in February, or right at the beginning of March, is technically when the lease is dated for, I signed a big, juicy 5-year lease at a new location with double the space and double the expenses of February/March of 2020. And then COVID hit. And now we're here. So for anybody possibly watching this in the future, yeah, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu academies are not allowed to train with partners. The way this works in Ontario, as a brief rundown, is that there's a general order from the province, and then local health units can interpret that as they like, and then all the businesses under the jurisdiction of that health unit have to comply. For the health unit where my business is located, they have some of the strictest interpretations of that law in the province, so they're not permitting any jiu-jitsu. So my business has essentially been closed for about 5 months. And so we've been dealing with that obstacle. And one of the things that I briefly alluded to earlier before I backtracked was I had developed a complacency with my 5-in-1 principle, because life had been going so well for a little while. For about a year, life was about as great as it could be. Now, life being as great as it could be is still, you know, like, we're still working 70 hours a week. We're still hustling. We're still doing all the work, all the headaches, all that stuff. All things that are well worth it. But things were going great, and I didn't have to concern myself with these things that I internalized because I was sufficiently distracted with how good things were going. And I didn't have to, I was resting on my laurels, basically. And Goggins, I know everybody likes to quote Goggins, but on one of his chats with Joe, he says something like, you know, people want to climb so they get to the top. They don't realize there is no top. There's only the climb. And I had lost sight of that. So I, again, had grown complacent where I was because things had been going so well. And then COVID hit. And this is kind of the third time in my life, and the first time since depression, that things got pretty bad. And I kind of had to rekindle or reignite, I should say, that mindset, and divert my resources elsewhere. And there's like other pursuits that I do in my life that I've been able to channel my efforts towards, just to make sure that I have something to work at, to keep my mind busy, which I think is important. But I found it interesting because it was the first time, and it's when I started actually picking up Marcus Aurelius's meditations. It was the first time since my depression that I really felt this way. And I didn't have breakdowns, and I didn't have those same manifestations, but some of the mindset came back, and it just reminded me how important it was to kind of be diligent about nothing is promised. So you have to, again, that's the 1 in the 5 and 1 principle. Like, nobody knows when that asteroid is going to hit, right? Like, it's happened before. Everything we take for granted, like, you could be dead in 5 minutes. Like, nobody has that guaranteed to them. I had a friend who he survived, but I had a friend who had a stroke in his late teens. I had a physics teacher who, healthiest 50-year-old I've ever seen in my life, had a stroke in the middle of a physics class and died. I have plenty of people in my family who have died under the age of 40. You don't know when that's going to happen. And I felt like I was definitely resting on my laurels. Now, we have to be a little bit forgiving with ourselves, I think, because what are we talking about resting on our laurels? Like, I was still hustling like crazy. I have a daughter. I have a family. It's not like I wasn't doing work. The laziness wasn't in what I was doing. It was in what I was thinking. And the problem with that I found was, if you're lazy with your thought pattern, but the execution still seems good, your thought pattern can erode the execution over time, because you can think to yourself that it's okay. You don't have to go do that extra thing because you're okay now. You don't have to put in that extra effort because you're established. And that's not conducive to a growth mindset. And I don't mean growth in any sort of material sense, but just in terms of personal fortitude, the anti-fragility we were talking about. I almost kind of stifled that aspect of me just out of the complacency. And COVID really brought that back out.
Yeah, that is so important. And I'm really just taking a moment to pause and let that sink in, because I think that that's a natural human thing that we do. And when I was doing rehab, I saw this all the time, right? Someone comes in with a knee replacement. Great, we're going to rehab you. Here's these exercises. The pain goes away and they stop the rehab exercises. Right. And then what happens is the pain comes back and their knee's all messed up. And we do. And what you said about how it's not always that the execution starts to slip, but rather that the mind and the thought patterns start to erode the execution.
Yes.
And we have to be so diligent, so careful, and so perceptive of our own mind, and really put in the work. Like people who, let's look at bodybuilders, right? They go to the gym, they're very diligent. It's that training that we also have to do for our mind. Every day, we got to be doing mind training. It is our greatest asset. And yet most of us, myself included, I slip all the time. We just forget about it, right?
Right. Yeah, one of the things my dad said to me when I was younger, and he's so many little lessons, but it sounds cliche, but when I was first starting to work out, he would be like, the days where you don't want to work out are the days that you have to go because that's what you're training. And it's like today, I even say, all worthy physical exercise is mental exercise, but not all mental exercise is physical exercise, because most physical exercises requires you to fight some level of very convincing momentum, whether that's, some sedentary lifestyle, whether that's distraction, whether that's this or the other. And I think there was a term that a guy who I started jiu-jitsu with in Mississauga, he trains in Burlington now, he's a firefighter, his name's Vic, great guy. I think he called it thresholding, which is like going to the very edge of something and then either holding yourself back or pushing yourself through. So like if it's like a goal, you want to push yourself through, but if it's like thresholding, might be like, oh, I've played a certain amount of video games, I have to stop or I have to dial it back, or like finding your limit and playing with that limit for the benefit of yourself, because it's more of a mind game than it is everything else.
Yeah.
It almost reminds me, there's this legendary professor of psych at McMaster. His name is Dr. Dick Day. And he used to do the intro to psychology class, but he left by the time I got there in 2007. He told us something that I thought was interesting, and I don't know how much this relates, but it was one of his great meta lessons. He mentioned some studies where it was for mental illness, they would give people drugs for some of them, and the biochemistry would fix itself immediately, but the symptoms would take months to kind of go away, despite the drugs actually working on the chemicals. And he said when they worked on them with CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, for the cases where that was effective, when they changed their behavior, the neurochemistry changed on its own, which I found incredibly interesting, because it's like, it's the thought patterns control so much, they influence so much, that like, if that's not the foundation of any plan of improvement, of any implementation of goals, you're going to have a really, really, really hard time executing those effectively. And that's even been the case for all of the jiu-jitsu competitors I've talked to. A lot of them do a lot of mindset training. They do a lot of visualization, a lot of going over their own thought patterns, because that's where a lot of the matches are won and lost.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't agree more. So COVID, you got this 5-year lease. How are you managing that? You caught yourself in this spot where you're resting on your laurels in terms of the mental side of things. Where are you with it now? And what was that like for you to catch yourself? What was it like for you to go see all your hard work be like,
There's I can't remember what the prayer is called. It's like give me like the knowledge to know what I can change, the something to know what I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference, or something. Yeah. So it's kind of one of those where at first it was like, okay, this is just another obstacle, don't worry about it. And then a month went by, and then I made the crucial mistake of starting to read what other people thought about things and on social media and all that jazz. And that started to weigh on my mind a little bit, because, not everybody is as scientifically informed as, I was a clinical research assistant who worked in clinical health. I'm by no means a doctor, but in terms of versus the general public, it was hard to see a lot of opinions on this and just kind of sit back and be like, yeah, okay. Trying to figure out what was going on, feeling very helpless in the beginning. And then I found I went through waves, and I found that the only way for me to manage my mental state was to focus myself on a project. I've always been able to express myself through my work. And because I write a lot, that's also something I do for my mental health. So like you said, you can't see the picture when you're in the picture. A lot of the time what I do is I open up a Word document. I'll write like 4 or 5 pages to myself, and I'm writing the picture, which is taking me out of the picture.
Yeah.
So that I can see my own words and I can work through it. And to be honest with you, that's the value in fiction for me, is people are drawing the picture. I mean, before, and I mentioned this, creepy enough, before the pandemic started, I read Stephen King's The Stand, which is about a super flu that kills 90% of the population, and sees how humanity handles it. And that kind of contextualized it for me. Before the George Floyd thing, I freaky enough read Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison, which touches on a lot of the same issues. So I kind of was able to internalize a little bit of what happened. So I worked through a lot of fiction and a lot of writing in order to kind of contextualize my thoughts and keep myself on the right path. Make sure I had something to focus on, because if you spend time alone with your thoughts, unless you can channel those in a meditative with some meditative skill, which I have a hard time doing, those thoughts can run away on you, and then you have to be really, like I said, diligent about staying on top of that thought pattern. So focusing on work and trying to recognize that it was out of my control was easier. Now, the problem is that as restrictions started to lift, there were some things that weren't in my control, but I no longer thought there was no more feeling that it was just the general event that was controlling it. There was one individual specifically that was restricting me from training, and that gave a focus to all my frustrations, which caused a lot of that anger that we talked about. And then I had to take that anger and I had to basically just find, again, a solution, because the anger is just going to destroy me. And if it destroys me, it's going to destroy my business. So I have to find a solution, and hopefully we found that solution. And it's an unfortunate solution, but it's one of those things where it's like, look, I'm in the middle of a roll. I almost won this match, but they got my arm. I have to tap. I have to come back tomorrow. As long as I can still do this, I'll be okay. And that's basically where we're at right now with the business.
Yeah. Thank you for being here and sharing so openly with me and with us. Because these are really important discussions to be having. And I think that having insight into the mind of someone like yourself who's gone through these things and say, here's what I've learned from it, right? And being able to share that with versions of ourselves and where other people are at, where, maybe they're not quite so far down that path yet, but they would certainly benefit a lot as they move towards that, right?
Right, 100%.
So one of my questions for you, Eric, is these challenges have done a lot for your life.
Right.
Do you see it that way on a regular basis? Or do you feel like things happen to you, or do you feel like things happen for you? I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
I think things happen to me. I'm not the kind of person who assigns any sort of necessarily fatalistic aspects to life. I don't subscribe to like manifesting destinies is not a good term for this, but that whole thing for me, it's I'm very indifferent to it. Life is just a successive series of moments that are complete. The universe is completely indifferent to our existence. Humans tend to impose more meaning on the universe that was likely there, and we could be right and we could be wrong. For me, the human condition is one that it's an insular point in this kind of like infinite pool of indifference. And what we do with that is our decision. It doesn't have to be insular. It can connect to others. And I find the most fulfilling way to do it is in this complete, again, if mortality is your reference point, you're constantly faced with oblivion, which is a very scary expanse and thing to hold in your mind. So being able to take what you can do and hook it onto something of purpose, something that hopefully involves others, if you're that kind of person, is essential. But I think that's up to the individual to assign that meaning, to find it, and their responsibility is to develop their own capacity for existing in this indifferent universe in a way that matters to them. That doesn't have to be some grand changing the world kind of thing. It could just be changing yourself for the better, but that's up to the individual. So that's about taking each experience you have and doing with it what you want. I don't think those things happen for people, but I think it's the person's responsibility, and our responsibility as a society to kind of groom people in a way that allows them to recognize those crucial moments and capitalize on them effectively. And I think that's the point of what I try to do in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, is at least to give a little bit of that anti-fragility, so that, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is not going to teach people how to identify their strengths, but it will help them pursue those strengths in the face of difficulty if they get there. So I found that was how I found my calling, and that's how I found my meaning and purpose and stuff like that. But that's very much a self-pursuit that has to be the responsibility of each individual.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you.
Awesome.
So a question for our listeners now are, what are you going to do in your life? what would become possible in your life if you applied these lessons and you overcame the current challenges or roadblocks?
So
I just meant that in general for the listeners. If you want to answer it though, feel free.
Oh, okay. For the listeners. Sorry, I thought it was for me.
Nope, that's okay. So, Eric, where can people reach you? If someone wants to reach out and chat with you, where can they reach you?
They can shoot me a message on Instagram at infinimbjj, or infinimbjj@gmail.com. Messages are the easiest way to get a hold of me.
Fantastic. If you found this podcast beneficial, please consider subscribing and sharing this episode with someone you know so that they can benefit from all of these incredible lessons as well. This podcast is brought to you by Sword Academy, where you can make the best you possible. You can find out more at swordacademy.ca. We will be live again next week with another episode on Saturday at 10 a.m. Eric, thank you so much for being here with me today. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for the transparency.
Thanks for having me, man. This was really cool.
Fantastic. See you later.